Thank you very much, Jerry. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to make one declaration before I start, and that's a simple apology to Martha Zeigert, because I think she probably knows all this already. But anyway, I doubt if there's a single person in this audience who has not heard of Richard Owen. Personally, I used his name for many years, knowing nothing more than the story of the Indian rhinoceros. I recall reading Colin Thomas's 1990 presidential address, The Glands of Owen, but the Hunterian professor business I didn't register. He was mentioned in Bill Bryce's book, and I really got curious at that point, and so I took an interest and started to look at things more closely. Owen's 1850 report of a compact yellow glandular body attached to the thyroid gland at a point where the veins emerge is on this specimen L331 from the Royal College of Surgery. Our surgeons, there's an arrow there, I think, pointing to the specific parathyroid gland, is the source of his fame among all endocrine surgeons, a few endocrinologists, and maybe a couple of anatomists. Was this his 15 minutes of fame? Let's look into this somewhat enigmatic life, which extended across the entire 19th century. He was born a middle-class family in Lancaster, England, and in 1804 attended the Lancaster Royal Grammar School. This recently installed plaque seems to make him Dinosaur Man. More about that in a few minutes. His penmanship teacher said that he was lazy and impudent, and prophesied that he would come to a bad end. His writing later was said to be quite good and very legible. He wrote all of his work longhand, which is hard to believe, and was known to be an excellent artist, illustrating most of his own work. At the age of 16, he began an apprenticeship with three different surgeons, three different Lancaster surgeons. The first died, the second joined the Navy, and the third did postmortems at the local jail, which fascinated him. But he wanted something more, so he enrolled at Edinburgh University. The anatomy course at the time was taught by the third Alexander Monroe, who the students called Tertius, using the lecture notes both his grandfather and father had used previously. So Owen enrolled in the anatomy and surgery course of John Barclay, who included comparative anatomy, the new comparative anatomy in his teaching. With another student, Owen helps organize a student medical society, which was prophetically called the Hunterian Society. And after 7 months, Barclay called him in and told him that he should go to London, meet his friend Abernathy, and study at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. He was shortly thereafter appointed prosector in Abernathy's surgical lectures. Within 16 months, at the age of 23, Owen obtained fellowship in the Royal College of Surgeons. Upon John Hunter's death, the government purchased his rare and valuable collection of 3,700 anatomical specimens, placing them in the custody of the College of Surgeons for cataloging and public exhibition. After 25 years, this task had not been completed. John Abernathy, that's better, as the then president of the college, and this is John Abernathy, recognized that Owen would probably do a very conscientious job with the collection and organized him getting a job with the college. In 1826, Owen Wood began working with William Cliff, Hunter's devoted last apprentice and curator of the collection. In 1828, Owen managed to get an appointment as a lecturer in comparative anatomy at St. Bartholomew's. As an aside, I gave some of this talk several years ago, and a British anesthetist informed me that you can only say bots if you're from Bots, because I had been using the term Barts throughout my talk, so you're warned in case you get yourself into that situation. 6 years later, Owen would become professor of comparative anatomy at Barts. In 1835, now beginning to get a flow of cash and making a bit of a living, and after a 7-year engagement, Owen married Carolyn Cliff, the curator's daughter. The couple took up residence in the newly completed apartment in the Royal College building. In 1836, he was appointed Hunterian professor at the Royal College of Surgeons, which awarded him the responsibility of providing an annual series of lectures, 24 lectures in fact, illustrating Hunter's vast collection. He delivered each of these lectures for the next 20 years without ever repeating one. Following the retirement of Sir Charles Bell of Bell's palsy in 1837, the next year, as professor of anatomy and physiology in the Royal College, Owen was elected to that vacant chair. At the age of 35 years, his title now was Hunterian Professor and Professor of Anatomy and Physiology in the Royal College of Surgeons, and he was said to be most gratified at his success. At that point, he was the most highly respected anatomist in Britain and was widely regarded throughout the continent. All of this has occurred within the first 33 years, a truly remarkable accomplishment for someone who came from relatively limited means without a university degree and from a small town in the north of England, topping off the greased pole of London academic medicine. His reputation attracted rich treasures from all over the world, particularly bones and fossils from extinct animals, as well as dissections of animals in the London Zoo, which, as the Hunterian professor, he had engineered first right of refusal upon their demise. While working on extinct specimens, he also looked at living animals and occasionally human tissue. He was sent a cadaver mussel which contained a cyst discovered by Bart's medical student James Paget, later called Sir James. Owen's study of this tissue would be the first recognition of Trichonia spiralis, the causative agent in trichinosis. In 1842, Owen used a combination of paleontology and comparative anatomy to assess the presence of fused sacral vertebrae and mammalian-like limb bones in fossils to classify large terrestrial reptiles under a new order that he named Dinosauria, from the Greek dinos, fearful or terrible, and sauros, lizard. While he was immensely productive from a scientific standpoint, he was no less so socially. He became a member of the Athenaeum Club and was elected to the very exclusive literary club whose 40 members reflected gentlemen of the highest intellect, wealth, and status. Owen was fluent in French, enjoyed poetry, music, and literature. He could sing, he could play the flute, and he was a very good cellist. He was a tall, ungainly, and had a large head and had very expressive eyes. And although ceremoniously courteous in general company, in the he was a delightful companion and close company. However, he could say hard things about an adversary or a professional rival. And later in life, this grew so acrimonious that many colleagues steered away from him, resulting in some degree of professional isolation. And over time, presumed loss of some well-deserved opportunities. However, when it came to politicians and power brokers, he was quite effective. Now, here he is in 1855, and take a look at his penmanship here. I think this is passable. In 1856, the next year, he left his post at the College of Surgeons and became superintendent of natural history at the British Museum, a position he would hold for the next 28 years until his 80th birthday. Almost immediately, he launched on a campaign to move the collection into a separate and removed purpose-built facility. He realized this vision would take many years, a great deal of energy, enormous capital expenditures, and political support from the very highest levels, which fortunately he obtained from Prime Minister Gladstone. After 7 years of construction in 1880, the magnificent British Museum of Natural History opened its doors. Located in South Kensington as part of the new cultural complex for science and technology, dubbed Albertopolis, in acknowledgement of the late Prince Regent Albert's great enthusiasm for the project. In 1850, the brilliant anatomist Thomas Henry Huxley, having just returned from his voyage in the survey vessel HMS Rattlesnake, petitioned Owen for sponsorship to obtain a scientific post. Huxley later wrote to a colleague in Australia, "It is astonishing with what intense feeling of hatred Owen is regarded by the majority of his contemporaries. The truth is he is superior to most and does not conceal that he knows it. And it must be confessed that he does some ill-mannered tricks now and then." Huxley wrote to his sister, "Owen has been amazingly civil to me, and it is through his writing to the First Lord that I got my present appointment. He is a queer fellow, more odd in appearance than ever, and more bland in manner. He is frightfully polite, that I never feel thoroughly at home with him." Owen knew Darwin and had studied some of the specimens from the Beagle in 1836, and had even read parts of Darwin's manuscript. Owen questioned Darwin about his use of some vague and non-scientific terms like "I think" and "I am convinced." But he told Darwin that he should leave them in because he felt they give the book a certain quaintness. He would later write an anonymous review, criticize his quaint style, and then proceed to reduce Darwin's facts to nonsense, adding that he had personally considered all of them a long time ago in the past. At the time, many in Britain were influenced by William Paley's 1802 book called Natural Theology, which proposed that the complex structure of living things required an intelligent designer and that God was the designer. Men of science, in that day, mostly they were theologians to start with, and scientists as an aside, believed that by studying nature, they were broadening their knowledge of God. The Paley theory justified Victorian social class status quo and social order. Emerging new scientific theories prevalent on the continent were viewed as materialistic, radical, and potentially provoking upheaval and British social order. That brings us to 1860 and the annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in the newly completed Oxford University Museum. This is the entrance portico, the apex of the entrance portico of the museum. And here you see a representation of an angel in the right hand holding a book and the left hand holding a cell. And this is kind of where science was and evolution was in those days. The first paper read was by New York University Professor Henry Draper. It was entitled Intellectual Development of Europe Considered with Reference to Reviews of Mr. Darwin. And he suggested that human progress would depend upon science shedding its religion influence. Next was the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, known by the students locally as Soapy Sam because of his slippery debating style. And he had rehearsed his talk the night before with Owen. Darwin was ill and was not present, but Thomas Huxley was in the audience. The bishop challenged Huxley to reveal whether the apes in his family were on his grandfather or grandmother's side. The audience of 700 crammed into the new museum, and this is a view, as best I could get, of the inside. It's a spectacular place. Applauded and demanded Huxley's rebuttal. Huxley replied that I have listened with great attention to the Lord Bishop's speech, but had been really unable to discern any new fact or a new argument in it, except indeed question raised as to my personal predilection in the matter of ancestry. If I would rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man highly endowed by nature and possessed of great influence, and yet who employs these faculties and influence for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape. Bedlam ensued. Darwin's captain, Robert Fitzroy, captain of the Beagle, who was quite religious at the beginning, was seen raising a large Bible over his head and shouting in the crowd, "Trust in the book." Several women fainted, and a reporter commented that he found the session uncommonly lively. The evolutionists would gradually gain the day. British science would flourish. Britain would become the richest country in the world, and Darwin's theory a metaphor for the rising 19th century middle class. And here we have a pylon out in front of the entrance to the museum celebrating the moment of the debate. And Owen and Huxley continued their debate, and they even went public with this, went into the public realm. Owen proposed a new classification for mammals in which humans were a separate order based on his contention that there were significant differences between apes, the brains of apes and man, i.e. the hippocampus minor in the fourth ventricle of man and its absence in apes. Huxley disagreed and clearly demonstrated a similarity between human and ape brains. Eventually discredited Owen before the Royal Society, charging that he had intentionally ignored clear evidence that would have refuted his claim. It's not the first time that Owen had been in trouble with the Royal Society. The British public came to accept Darwin's theory. There is a hint that later Owen may have mellowed a bit in his stand, but it's not well documented. Interestingly enough, in America we have had the Scopes monkey trial and several Supreme Court decisions, and even today, after 155 years, it is said that 30% of our countrymen do not subscribe to evolution as proposed by Darwin. In the 1860s, Owen was asked to tutor Queen Victoria's children at Buckingham Palace and at Windsor Castle. In 1842, Owen had been provided with a pension of £200 per year, and in 1852, Victoria gave him the use of Sheen Lodge in Richmond Park. And this is the best picture I could find of it. It does not exist anymore. Where he would live the rest of his life. His son committed suicide, and so in his old age, Owen was taking care of the widowed daughter-in-law and her 7 children. And they were allowed to Victoria allowed them to stay on after her demise. Clearly, he was quite favored by the royals. Owen would continue to write, completing 3 large volumes entitled Anatomy and Physiology of Vertebrates, mentioning the details of the compact yellow glandular body that he saw so many years before in the rhinoceros. He also completed 2 large octavo volumes of John Hunter's notes, records, and manuscripts, and published his last paper in 1883, 57 years after his first paper, which was on the anatomy of an orangutan, which he got from the zoo. 57 years after his leaving, a body of work in excess of 640 papers, most of them single author papers, books and pamphlets. Queen Victoria knighted him and increased his pension by £100. In 1883, he would step down as the superintendent of the Museum of Natural History. Just 3 years after it opened, and he retired to Sheen Lodge with his grandchildren, its gardens, and fishing. He wrote a short monograph entitled Notes on the Birds in My Garden. Owen died of old age at 88 years in 1892 without knowing that his encounter with his ponderous and respectable old friend and client, the rhinoceros, as he mentioned, 43 years before, would be one of the most memorable accomplishments of his career. In 1894, his grandson published a 2-volume biography of Owen based on Caroline Owen's daily diaries, 1,500 personal letters, and 15,000 pieces of professional correspondence. He asked Huxley if he would mind writing a commentary, which turned out to be 60 pages, and concluded that Owen's claim to a high place among those who made great and permanently valuable contributions to knowledge remains unassailable. Owen's career basically can be viewed in my mind, in 2 parts, the Hunterian and the Museum of Natural History sections. In the former, he was young, had a big ego, was highly energetic and overachieving. He did not tolerate rivals or criticism and violated all the rules to get ahead, and I mean all the rules. In the latter, he by necessity was more collaborative, probably the only way he could get things done in the bureaucracy of the British Museum was to collaborate with people, otherwise he would have been probably tossed out on his head. And he seems to have gotten his ego under more control. Maybe it was his age. Maybe he was hoping for a real legacy of accomplishment, i.e. that spectacular Museum of Natural History. His inability, either because of his personal religious feelings or the fear of losing the backing of his Oxbridge supporters, to accept Darwin's theory definitely furthered his isolation. Up-and-coming scientists knew little about him at his death, and he was not soon forgotten. I do not believe finding the gland-like tissue in the neck of the rhinoceros was his 15 minutes of fame at all, but it was wonderful that it happened and that we are able to stand on his shoulders 150 years later. Now, I have a little epilogue here, a few things that I've gathered. We have 1885, Darwin had a statue carved, and it was done by a committee because he was dead at that time. And this was placed in the Museum of Natural History. Now you remember Owen left the Museum of Natural History in 1883. 2 years later, Darwin comes in, and they put his statue up on the main mezzanine stairs. Owen's bronze statue, which was made in 1897, stood along one of the outside walls near the entrance door until they had to do something with the floor there because of an incoming elephant or something. And they moved him upstairs and to the back wall. Here's the stairs at the very top. There we go. The stairs at the very top of the slide are where Darwin is located. This is the most prominent place in the museum. So Owen built it, Darwin lives in it. I guess it's fair. And here's Owen. You can see a little dust on his bronze statue. It's up there behind a stairwell, hidden away. You have to go looking for it. Now, I apologize for the date here. This date is wrong. It's May 11th, 1940. This is the Hunterian Museum that Owen worked in for years and years putting it together, and the museum where we, in the year 2000, when we were in London, had a cocktail party. You can see they've fixed it up since that night. It looks much nicer now, but about a third of the collection was lost in that bombing raid. And I finally found out about Sheen Palace. I've been asking a bunch of people for years where it was, and I found out recently that it was bombed in 1944. So it's gone, and just about all the evidence of Owen is gone. And he's not remembered very much except for being maybe the dinosaur man and the parathyroid man by us. So thank you very much for this opportunity.